All right. Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here. Welcome to Remark. I'm Stefanos Geroulanos. I'm the director of the Institute, and I will be chairing the session today. With me, I have Samantha Paul and Amy Nguyen, who have organized the event, as so much else at Remark the last 2 years. So I wanted to start by noting that this is our first in a series of events on technology, the environment, and the future of Europe, which is a program which is generously supported by Open Society Foundation. And I'm delighted that we opened this all by getting to celebrate and discuss Liliana Draganova's book, Discounting the Future, the Ascendancy of Political Technology, which is just out with Zone Books in their near future series. And which you can also, by the way, in case you weren't looking as you walked in, can also get a copy of right outside. Now, Liliana, who is a Technology, Environment, and the Future of Europe Fellow at Remark this semester, is a professor at the Centre de Sociologie de l'Innovation of the, what used to be called the École des Mines, which is now called simply Mines, at the University of Paris Sciences et Lettres, PSL. And she's the author of 2 more books, Valoriser la Science, from 2013, and the collective work Capitalization, a Cultural Guide from 2017. Allow me to open things a bit differently, though, by emphasizing what a radiant work we have before us, in my case, literally today. At one level, this book masquerades as a history of a specific problem in economic thought, the problem of valuing present investments on the basis of future flows. But in a much broader way, as she points out in the beginning and the end of the economic, sociological, and historical analysis that she carries out, the problem of discounting is nothing like a limited or a simple issue of valuation. It is, as she shows, a major political technology of our time, and one that has been and continues to spread. She ends the book by discussing the management of poverty, and she opens it with the first compelling explanation of why climate action, one of obvious major concerns, both in the TEFID program here and obviously everywhere, why climate action is so incredibly difficult at the state level as well as at the corporate level. How could we have a ministry of the future, she asks, that doesn't simply rely on a market logic for valuing future flows and therefore discounting the importance of climate change, the devastating consequences of climate change? How could we be seeing social, environmental, and political issues on different terms? I'm not going to intrude more on your introduction of the book, but I'm going to simply say that we're also very grateful to have with us 2 leading intellectuals who are particularly well positioned to discuss the book. The political theorist and historian Tim Mitchell, here at the table, the William B. Ransford Professor of Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies at Columbia, who is also the author of several books, including Colonizing Egypt, Rule of Experts, Egypt, Technopolitics, Modernity, and Carbon Democracy, Political Power in the Age of Oil. And Kate Zaloom, Professor of Social and Cultural Analysis here at NYU, who is, among other things, founding editor of Public Books, which is how I first ended up reading you, came to reading you. Second, and also the author of Indebted, How Families Make College Work at Any Cost, as well as Out of the Pits, Traders in Technology from Chicago to London. So I'm about to stop, and I'm going to say that the way that we'll run it is that Liliana is going to talk for somewhere around 15 minutes in the beginning, and then Kate is going to address Liliana with first commentary and questions, and then we'll move to Tim, and then we'll open it up for everybody. Please keep your remarks to under a minute. If you're going to ask a question, make sure that there is a question as you're preparing it. For those of you who are online, please post a question in the Q&A and it'll be conveyed to me, so I will raise it myself. So, and also please do introduce yourselves when you're asking a question. So I think that's where we are. Welcome, Liliana. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefanos. Thanks to you and to the Remark Institute for hosting this book launch, and also for inviting me as a research fellow this spring here. I could have imagined no better environment, I think, to accompany the first steps of this book out there in the world. So why a book on discounting, an object that economics and finance scholars normally deal with? And what is discounting to begin with? Let me introduce it the way I encounter it, probably more than 10 years ago now. When I was studying the biotechnology industry, I was intrigued by a puzzle. The business of biotech startups, and of startups more generally, is to sell the future. So biotech startups were selling promises of future drugs to pharmaceutical companies at prices often ranging in millions of dollars. How are these prices determined and agreed upon at a stage when close to nothing was known about the goods to which these prices referred? When I would ask this to my respondents, they would tell me, well, it's simple. We have books, and in the books, there are tools. So I started opening these books, and discounting was often the first tool that these books would mention. And it is actually the first thing that corporate finance textbooks would teach to aspiring managers. To decide in which projects to invest, you should calculate the value of this project using discounting formulas. And interestingly, these same formulas are taught to aspiring policymakers. To decide which public policy to implement, you should calculate the value of this policy using discounting formulas again. In one setting, discounting formulas are called DCF for discounted cash flow or NPV for net present value. In the other setting, they are called CBA for cost-benefit analysis. Discounting formulas basically state that the value of something, an investment project, a public policy, human life, nature, is equal to the flows of costs and revenues that this thing is likely to generate in the future. Because these flows occur at different points in time, like year 1, year 2, year 10, year 100, they are made commensurate by being all translated into their so-called present value. Each flow that occurs in the future gets reduced by the so-called discount rate. You can think of the discount rate mathematically as the inverse of the interest rate. The interest rate translates present value into future value. Moving from the present to the future value expands. The discount rate goes in the opposite direction, from the future to the present. Moving in this direction, value shrinks. Because, as the saying goes, $1 today is worth more than $1 tomorrow. Or a bird in the hand is worth 2 in the bush. It's exactly the same idea that discounted carries. Now, what kind of theory of time is embedded in discounting? Its most blatant characteristic is the contradiction that it carries. On the one hand, discounting formulas value the future as the relevant temporality for guiding action in the present, as the direction to which we should look. On the other hand, discounting formulas devalue the future as a time that is less worthy than the present because it is distant in time and uncertain. This twofold valuation-devaluation of the future causes trouble. First, because discounting turns to the future, it faces the problem of uncertainty, a problem that has been addressed in economics and economic sociology as well. Some would argue that the values produced by that kind of formulas, based on projections about the future, are no more relevant than the reflections that one could observe in a crystal ball. The only difference being that they carry the disguise of rationality and objectivity. Now, second, because discounting devalues the future, it discriminates against projects and policies whose effects are long-term and distant in time. In the world of business, discounting has been accused of killing innovation, introducing myopia, short-termism. In the world of business policy, discounting has been accused of leading to climate inaction and sacrificing future generations by turning ambitious policies whose benefits are distant in the future into worthless propositions that no rational government should pursue. In spite of these troubles, discounting has remained unwavering. Let me take one example. In 2006, Nicholas Stern, to whom the government of the United Kingdom commissioned a report on the economics of climate change, made the proposition to bring the discount rate to almost zero so that the future could weigh as much as the present, and hence justify the implementation of ambitious climate policies. William Nordhaus, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics precisely for integrating climate change into macroeconomic analysis, outragedly replied that this was impossible. The discount rate was not something that we can decide upon, it's something that we can observe. This view of discounting is widespread. The value we give to the future is something that pertains to the nature of the economy, to the laws of the markets, to the psychology of individuals and their so-called time preferences that entail a systematic bias against the future. It is not, and it should not be, political, according to this view. Now, the argument developed in this book says exactly the opposite. Discounting is a political technology. This is what this book argues. To decipher the politics of discounting, the book applies the analytical apparatus of STS, Science and Technology Studies. It opens the black box of these discounting formulas with two classical tricks in STS. First, go back to history to denaturalize, and second, focus on moments of controversy, in which the script of the technical artifacts, to use Madeleine Krisch's term, becomes visible. So the book follows discounting in different moments and in different sites. And what it follows is actually a mathematical formula, but also a way of reasoning and a mode of engaging with the future by means of its valuation and devaluation. What emerges from this inquiry presented in the book is neither the history of an idea nor the history of a technology, but rather a collection of situations in which the relationship to the future that is materialized in discounting has been put to the test and transformed. Let me give a few examples before concluding. First, not in chronological order, is a book published in 1906 by North American economist Irving Fisher. In opposition to other theories of capital, Fisher argued that capital is not defined by its particular substance, but by its relationship with time. Capital is anything that produces flows in the future. In other words, anything can become capital as long as it projects itself into the future. And when it does so, its value stems from the value of its discounted future cash flows. Fisher calls this the principle of capitalization, a principle through which capital comes into being. Its implication is both straightforward and disturbing. To quote Fisher, the value of any article of wealth or property is dependent alone on the future, not the past. As I argue in the book, this singular combination of temporality and valuation, which brushes off the past, produces the universalizing ambition of discounting to account for the value of all things, once they get projected into the future and disentangled from the particulars of their present characteristics and their past histories. To justify this rather counterintuitive principle, Fisher referred to the calculations of German foresters in the 19th century, who had proposed formulas to value forest land by the future flows of wood and timber that it would yield. Delving into the foresters' calculations, one chapter of this book observes the curious effects of discounting on forests in the 19th century. On the one hand, devaluing the future through discounting produced an effect of acceleration. The idea that time had a cost led to the recommendation to fell trees at an earlier age. On the other hand, valuing the future entailed a critique of alternative temporalities, namely the present temporality of the local populations who lived from what the forest readily offered to them, and whose poverty, it was said, impeded them from looking to the future. These two effects epitomize the politics of discounting. It bears the idea that the future, caring for the future, requires a form of sacrifice that only certain actors have the capacity to offer. I fast forward to 1951, when Joel Dean, professor of economics at Columbia University and founder of the consulting firm Joel Dean Associates, published a book in which he positioned discounting as the tool that companies should use to make decisions about their investments. He introduced an important change in the formula that Irving Fisher and 19th century foresters had imagined. The discount rate, Dean said, was no longer equal to the rate of interest, reflecting the cost of time, but to the so-called cost of capital, reflecting the returns required by investors. Thus redefined, in the middle of the 20th century, discount rates markedly increased. The price to be paid for the future was henceforth higher, and the entity to whom this price was to be paid took shape in the figure of the investor. And this is not just a metaphor. The last two chapters of the book analyze the implications of this view of the future in two parts of today's economy. First, the global biopharmaceutical industry, and second, investor-state dispute settlement in international law. In the biopharmaceutical industry, discounting is at stake when the increasingly high prices of drugs are justified by the need to reward investors for the uncertainty that they have endorsed. In international law, discounting has been mobilized to calculate the compensations to be paid to investors in the event of expropriation, or more recently, in the event of the implementation of environmental regulation. When such compensations are based on the future flows of costs and revenues that the investment would have yielded had it been continued, they provide investors with the rare privilege to claim that the expectations that they had formed while making their evaluations should actually be fulfilled. So, why a book on discounting? I wish that this book could help understand and intervene in such contemporary situations by developing a critique of the view of the future as an investment. My hope also is that it can help shed light on the crisis of temporality that we are said to be experiencing, as we find ourselves cornered in a present that is simultaneously drawn into the future through the appeal to innovation and disruption, and devoid of future through the looming loss of life and hope. Thank you for your attention.
Well, first, I'd just like to say thank you for this book, Liliana, and also for this invitation, Stefanos, because it was really a pleasure to get to engage with your thinking, and so I just want to talk a little bit about what was inspiring to me and what it also made me think about. I was really intrigued by the big story that this book tells, which is, from my view, about the production of political inaction, especially around climate change. And of course, it's a very tall order to explain why something is not happening, right? That's tricky. So I think it was really an excellent choice to examine this way of thinking about the future that highlights the costs to investors today in order to reap a benefit or a stream of income that will be realized later, and the technology that's used to sort of account for that relationship. That technology, as you've heard, is discounting. And so to mainstream economists and business people and those that have taken on the thinking with economic concepts and tools, discounting represents a method for assigning monetary or other measurable value to present goods. However, Liliana emphasizes that discounting is more than a method. It's not only a method, it is a theory of value that also contains a theory of action. Both are rooted in the present relationship to the future as a calculative anchor and also a point of value realization. So she argues that for this reason, the technique is inherently political, and it absolutely concerns the distribution of goods. I don't even think that it pretends not to, although that isn't always discussed. So, so to me, one of the most important things about this book is that it takes you through the way that the technique hides its politics. And how it replaces an explicit debate about who gets what when, with a formula that carries the authority to produce truth, the value of a good in the present. So it's pretty much one for the other. And that makes it fundamentally also a technique for taking decisions about distribution today, which have a huge impact on the future. In other words, these are political, they are political decisions, even when they're not in the realm of state action. So in an important section very early on, Liliana describes how the foundations of modern discounting was based in an explicitly political problem. And this is like right in the introduction. She discusses the history of cost-benefit analysis, which is, kind of critically related to discounting, and which was, according to Ted Porter, brought into the US federal government in 1936 with the Flood Control Act, which bound Congress to authorize projects only if they had been examined essentially by two sets of experts. One was the Army Corps of Engineers with their tools, and the other were government economists with their tools. So cost-benefit analysis was developed specifically to be a governing technology. To decide what measures the federal government should take and not take. But then how do both CBA and discounting to hide their politics when the roots are so unambiguous? And the answer I believe the book gives is that they do that by controlling the discourse of present value. Liliana starts off her fascinating book with a story that I want to talk a little bit about, because in order to set up a similar one. But the story in Discounting the Future is a conflict between two economists, between Nicholas Stern and William Nordhaus, who you mentioned. Stern authored a report for the UK government, essentially justifying acting on climate change. He set the discount rate low in order to take into account the needs of future generations. William Nordhaus, who would win the economics prize known as the Nobel, objected. He called Stern's view extreme and not based on observations in the marketplace, meaning that Stern was undervaluing the present to justify action. In other words, Nordhaus, even after the turn of the century, was arguing for inaction, at least of the kind that Stern wanted. So both Stern and Nordhaus's assessments were obviously political, but as Liliana knows, they were consistent in their uses of discounting and united in their arguments' key issue, which is how steep the discount rate should be. So in this story, politics resides in the rate and economic knowledge has won, right? I also want to offer a kind of complementary view that I think should work together, which is that politics also bends economic knowledge to its own ends. Some economists and their economics are welcome. Other economics and economists are not. Some politicians in the US, especially Republicans, take up particular kinds of economic thinking when it suits them and discard it when it doesn't. We actually got to hear about this last night in the State of the Union address when Biden declared the end of trickle-down economics and decried the 2017 tax cut, which the Office of Management and Budget Economists tried to take down at its inception. But while that is all very recent, we can actually see this kind of conflict around expertise all the way back in 1967. That year, senators already knew that something was wrong. Recent reports then had shown that even during those years of peak American prosperity, as government economists were measuring it, Millions of citizens were suffering from malnutrition and starvation, even despite the country's overwhelming wealth. American children were also more likely to die, even than in far less affluent countries. And the senators wanted to know what could have happened, especially in those days when the unemployment rate wasn't even reaching 4%. So the Senate held hearings to discuss widening the expertise available to both Congress and the president. And even the Council of Economic Advisors executive secretary, who testified at the hearing, couldn't ignore the problem the senators had identified. Professor Bertram Gross voiced his concern to Congress that a new Philistinism had which is his terrible word, but gets the point, new Philistinism, had quietly turned politics toward its bidding by expressing, quote, national goals and performance in dollar sign figures. Both he and the senators wanted something different. Senator Mondale and his co-sponsors put forward a bill to establish the Council of Social Advisors, which would be tasked with accounting for social health. That was their category. The council would assess whether Americans of all backgrounds enjoyed equal access to health, education, housing, the arts, and the humanities. Fascinating, in 1967. The Senate actually even passed the act twice, in 1970 and 72, but the House voted it down both times. In other words, conflicts among values and how to measure them are critical grounds for modern politics, and not only inside the calculation, but also in the halls of power. So I'd like to add one more story, one that actually also involves Nordhaus, and the complicity of his version of economics in climate inaction. This time, not by arguing about discount rates, but about sidelining another set of experts. So since the 1980s, independent natural scientists have argued that we have to find a way to address global warming. I'm sure that all of you know that. But economists, often in league with the oil industry, have stood in the way by casting the effects of climate-related natural disasters as uncertain and urgent action as too costly. Now, in a critical 1983 National Academy of Sciences report called Changing Climate, report of the Carbon Dioxide Assessment Committee, a group of prominent economists hewed to the accepted economic position to view the natural science with skepticism. Their contribution to the report avoided focusing on what the natural scientists knew, and instead emphasized what the economists did not. There were many scenarios for exactly how climate change would play out. They said, who could say which would happen? They asked doubtfully. Policies for addressing climate change were actually uncertain too. Carbon taxes were a promising way to stop polluters, but they would be hard to enforce and also expensive. And anyway, William Nordhaus himself wrote, whether the imponderable side effects on society, on coastlines and agriculture, on life and high latitudes, on human health, and simply the unforeseen will in the end prove more costly than a stringent abatement of greenhouse gases, we do not know. Based on those doubts, they added for politicians to wait and see, which is precisely what happened. So Liliana's book is critical for understanding the commitment to discounting as a way of thinking about the future, and the adherence to that model of embracing the status quo and its distribution of benefits in the present is both interested and ideological. Liliana helps us see this by tracing the history and politics of discounting techniques. It's also important to consider the politics of economics and its place in government. This would mean building on this book to examine alternative techniques of valuation, including values that escape reduction to monetary measures. We might even think of these as rights. Rights to security from floods and hurricanes in the present, and maybe even a right to the future itself. Thank you.
discuss in the room?
Actually,
Yeah, I can react quickly. Thank you so much. First, I would like to react on two things. The first one is this idea of how discounting hides its politics, while at the same time it is in a way blatantly political because it is about making decisions, and we know that decisions are political. I would like to take one example I've been working on recently since the book has been completed, which is something called value-based pricing of pharmaceuticals in particular. Value-based pricing is a new way of pricing drugs, which relates to, which is supposed to reflect the value that drugs will bring to patients and society rather than the past costs of research and development. And it has been used to justify the recent series of most expensive drugs ever, in particular for gene therapies. And value-based pricing comes as the truth of economic theory, of course. Prices are based on value, and value is something that comes from the future. And I've been working with patient organizations who are trying to challenge these arguments and who are being told, who propose that prices could take into account also past costs, and who are being told, no, this is not how economics works. You do not understand value. So at the same time, there's this idea of discounting being blatantly political, but it continues to hide its politics when these politics come in the disguise of economic truth. So one of the objectives I have been having with this book is to open the black box of discounting and to show that this is just one way of thinking about value, which is embedded in the discipline of economics in particular, which has particular consequences, etc. So it's interesting, but it continues to hide its politics. Probably not when we talk about climate change, but when we move to other places. The second short comment that I would like to make relates to the expertise of economics versus other sciences to think about nature and the environment. I think one of the arguments I'm making in this book that by turning to the future and by valuing things through the future flows that they are likely to produce, discounting and this version of economics has been able to account for the value of anything. From this idea of discounting and capitalization comes the idea of human capital, for example. The idea that our value as human beings lies in the flows of revenues and costs that we are likely to produce in the future. So Gary Becker's idea. More recently, I think concepts of natural capital, for example, take exactly the same logic. So value nature not by the care that we have taken of it in the past or the way populations who live with nature are taking care of it, but by future flows of, in this case, ecosystem services, for example, and payments for ecosystem services. So there is a striking capacity of discounting and economics to, how can I say, to go into many different places of expertise and to compete with different sciences, in particular the natural sciences, in accounting for what is the value of things and what should be done about these things. Yeah, so these are two just quick remarks. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Thanks to Stefanos for the invitation to be here, and of course to Liliana for the opportunity to read this amazing book and to discuss it. I'm actually just going to pose quickly a couple of questions rather than continue to describe all the wonderful things about the book. I hope people will take that as said, and as Caitlin has already herself said. The first question is this amazing thing about discounting, which is that the very fact of being able to claim something from the future at a discount, right? That you can, thanks to the process of discounting, you can acquire, let's say, $100 available next year for only $90 this year. And one of the things you're opening up for us is a very interesting way of thinking about how that's possible. What were the forms of calculability and of argument that made it possible to exchange $90 for $100, to take two identical things and simply get more for one. And one of the questions that comes from that, which I want to know you're thinking about, is that who actually pays that $10? Because the great thing about your analysis is none of the standard answers will work. I mean, the standard answer will be, well, that's the rate of interest. But as you've shown us, the rate of interest is simply this technology of discounting run in the opposite direction. It doesn't answer the question of where that surplus is coming from. It tells us a little bit from a different point of view, the same answer. It can't simply be the case that money has some natural ability, either based as some would say in human preference for immediate gratification, as Irving Fisher would have said, because money itself, of course, is just a claim on the future. It's not some essence that has some kind of power in it, and you're showing us how those claims on the future work and are organized. Nor can it be said that the gain, the increase, comes from some improvement. That argument is often made, and so Schumpeter, for example, writing at about the same time, is saying, no, this is the role of the entrepreneur who introduces some radical reorganization of things and improves. But the trouble is, in Fisher's famous example that you cite of the apple orchard, there's no improvement required. You don't even have to make an apple orchard. There's an apple orchard already there. You haven't done anything. You've just been able to value the future and acquire that future at a lower price. So it's nothing to do with any kind of claim of improvement or development. Weber, writing at the same time or just before in the 1890s, wrote these two amazing articles on this phenomenon, the two essays he wrote on the stock exchange. And he said it's a tax. It's a mode, discounting or the valuing of shares is a mode of imposing a tax on the future, because when you discount in the present the value of the shares in a railway company, that is being repaid in the future by everyone who purchases a railway ticket, who earns a wage that is depressed by the need to maintain the value of the share, and so on. And he had a very clear argument that this is paid from the future by those who are taxed through the process of discounting. I'm curious what light you can throw from, because you've studied this at so many different points and not just the point I focused on at the late 19th, early 20th century. Are there other arguments about where it comes from? And is part of the work that discounting is doing not only, as it claims to do, and you take apart those claims in all kinds of ways, allowing this differing valuation of rival projects or differing value of the future versus the present, it is actually itself operating as this mode of taxation of the future? That's my first question. It's not a big question. Yeah, go ahead.
That's a big question. A few thoughts. It won't be an answer. It is interesting, I think, that one of the so discounting has existed for a long time in finance, right? This idea that you have a discount if you pay, for example, back your loan earlier, but it's only the 19th century that it starts to be applied to so-called real assets. And I think it's not a coincidence that it was first formalized in the case of forests. Forests have something very, very interesting. They have a very interesting particularity, which, as I'm using here the words of François Vatin, a French sociologist, forests are pure capital. They do not require labor. They grow. Trees just grow. So in the forest, you have this vision of something that does not require improvement, that something that, and of a future that is in a way already there and that can be planned and that can be taxed if we use this term. So this idea that this idea of discounting, I think, is very much related to places, situations, settings in which you can, in a way, the future can already be seen or imagined. The future can be there. Now, this future is not a future, it's actually a present, because the forest is here now. So it's at the same time, it's a projection on the future, but it's also something that is present now. And the idea of imagining the forest as like as pure capital and projecting towards their growth has gone hand in hand with their emptying from their present, emptying in particular from the, as I mentioned, from the populations who live from the forest, taking fallen branches, taking fruits, etc. So there has been this this idea of I would say a taxation of the future, but which is also only possible when this future is actually is already here in a way, and a taxation of the future, which is actually a taxation of the present, because discounting serves also to instrument claims about the allocation of resources. And this allocation of resources happens in the present. It's present claims on available current resources that are being justified by the idea of what these resources might yield in the future. So when we think of, for example, discussions about discounting and climate change, this idea of future generations and the fact that discounting can be seen as a tax on future generations. And several authors have argued that this is a discrimination against future generations, from a colonization of the space of the future, because we are living on the space of future generations. We are consuming actually their wealth, right, by bringing it now in the present. So this would go well enough with the idea of discounting as a mode of taxation of the future. But I would argue that in settings like forests, mining, when we are, how can I say, when we are grounded in particular present situations, discounting is as much a taxation of the present, actually, or a redistribution of present resources according to future temporalities. I don't know if this answers your question. I'm just thinking at the same time.
Well, that allows me to connect to my second question. So what you say about the forest makes absolute sense, but of course that it's there in the present, and it's also got that sort of natural process of its own continued existence, but it's also got to be very vigorously policed. And you've got this amazing material from the studies of 19th century forestry that 80% of the people being imprisoned in, I think it's in Bavaria that you're writing about, are imprisoned for the theft of wood, and the famous Marx early article on the theft of wood and those kinds of discussions. So it's got to be policed in the present to do that. But of course, to calculate that future, there's got to be a degree of certainty that that policing will continue into the future. And so one of the things you've got to do is actually think about, and your discussion on German forestry is amazing, what is the kind of future that can guarantee, in particular, the forms of policing and property rights and so on. And those arguments at that time that only the state has that, what the thing the state is this political entity that continues through into the future, which I think is absolutely fascinating to think about the very conception of statehood as it's emerging in that period. But the way it leads into my second question is this. In what way are the poor, whether in that example from the 19th century or more contemporary ones, disadvantaged by discounting? And the kinds of examples you tend to cite take the form that they're disadvantaged because unlike those with capital, that is to say, those able to organize successful claims on future revenue, the poor have to live in the present, right? They're restricted to a horizon of the present by the lack of availability to them of a set of political claims on future revenue, i.e. capital. But there's another way. This is meant to be a question, but isn't there another way to think about that? Because one of the wonderful things about the book is the way you constantly engage with debates about time and temporality itself, and show us new ways of, you know, from Koselleck to many others, you show us the difference between what we learn about modern forms of temporalities from this and what we might learn from Beckett or Koselleck or others. And I think it's absolutely fascinating. And one of the things that comes out of your discussion again and again is the present and the future are not simple temporalities, but they coexist in the present. What you don't quite say is that so does the past. I mean, I think you do actually say that elsewhere, but the past coexists as well. And once one thinks of discounting as a taxation of the future, of those who come later, then the present, and particularly the present of the poor, is actually they're living that past in the present. That past, when their future was taxed, has now become the present, because they're not, you know, discounting is not only prospective of what we might do, it's also something that happened in the past, and we are now living, paying back that debt from the past. Once you say that, I mean, I was a little worried that that notion that the poor don't have, you know, they're different because they don't have capital. It was a bit too much of a Piketty, Hilton is working in the Piketty there, a Thomas Piketty sort of view that, you know, there's either returns to labor or there's returns to capital. But of course, once you understand the poor in the present as those who are paying back the interest or the discount set up in the past, then there's no distinction between, you know, some people just have labor and others just have capital. It's rather that you're differently situated in relation to the past as much to the present. Told you it didn't really become a question, but but that does provide a slightly different way than the one you lay out in the book, perhaps, for thinking about how the poor are disadvantaged by practices of discounting. They're also the victims of past practices of discounting because they're paying back that debt. Go ahead, yeah. I'm going to stop with those two questions because I want to leave enough time for everybody else.
I think, I mean, there was supposed to be one chapter in the book on the poor, which I never managed to, had the time to write, in which I wanted to talk about experiments with discounting on poor populations, because discounting is something that I mean, there is a critique. There are explanations of poverty that are being put forward today, saying that poverty, and that goes together with the ideas of entrepreneurship, etc., that poverty is something that is due to the poor themselves. Because of the way they act. And one of the ways in which they act is that they don't care about the future. This is a critique that is made to poor people. And they don't care about the future because they are stuck in the present. So there are experiments that are being carried out on populations defined as poor, in which economists try to measure their discount rates, the discount rates that are supposed to be in their head. For example, by asking them, would you prefer to have a little bit of this now or a little bit of that in 1 year, which in itself is a quite strange question to ask to people who don't have much, and maybe they don't even have a year after. So in itself, it's a strange setting, and they tend to show that such kind of that indeed the poor have high discount rates in their heads. And there are also experiments going on to help the poor by decreasing their discount rates and making them care more about the future. There is something, things called, for example, commitment devices that go from like, they can take the form of special bank loans, but also of a box where you put your money, you close it, and the experimenter takes the key so that you cannot spend your money now and you're forced to care about the future. And I was appalled by this way of of forcing, like, how can producing a distribution of responsibility in which the poor are types of population defined the poor are accused of not caring for the future and leading to environmental degradation. This is also part of how the argument continues. While at the same time, Nordhaus is saying that we cannot decrease our discount rates, of course, because our discount rates, they're not in our heads, they're in the nature of the economy, they're in the truth. So there is a kind of truth of our developed countries' discount rates, while the poor, they have their own discount rates in their heads. So this is the kind of discussions that I wanted to engage with, this critique of certain types of population about not caring about the future, and the redistribution of abilities to care about the future between different actors, which in my view happened a lot. I mean, a great part of this happened in the 19th century. Koselleck talks about this moment of temporalization in which the modern regime of temporality comes in, and there is a kind of opening of the future. The future was hitherto closed, controlled by the church, and limited by the horizon by apocalyptic horizon. It was a closed future. And then with modernity and capitalism, the future opens up. It becomes a space of possibilities, of opportunities. And what I'm trying to hint at is that when this future opens up, opens also a struggle for who's going to control that open future. And Koselleck talks a little bit about this, about states had a battle against the church to become the owners of the future, to the controllers of the future, banning any form of prediction, for example, of prophecy. So that kind of control over the future was part, indeed, of the building of states. And what discounting shows us, I mean, what the story shows us, is that it has also been a part of cornering some types of population into a particular temporality, which is the temporality of the present. So this is the kind of argument I'm trying to make. Now, is this temporality of the present in which they are cornered also a result of the past? Is a very interesting question that I don't really know how to you can have a very simple answer to that. If you take an example, if discounting leads to it impedes us for example, implementing ambitious climate policies. Well, indeed, probably the situation in which populations would be now is part of that kind of decisions made with discounting. So indeed, this idea of being stuck in the present is related to past discounting situations. Yeah. So it's a yes, and at the same time, it's a bit. The argument I'm trying to make is a bit different. Is an argument of how can I say, of moderating the kind of critique of the temporality of certain groups of actors.
Mm.
Let me actually jump in and ask something that builds off something that Kate started asking or discussing, and I think there was more of a question in there that the reaction really allowed, which is to say, isn't somehow the really potentially devastating part of discounting, not that it acts necessarily on its own. I sort of took you to mean this with a Republican example. But that it's one political technology among many, which wouldn't sort of mean like, well, people are shaped or made up in Ian Hackingson's by multiple tools, but rather that like when nothing else is also working, like this is really the thing, or that if you put them one on top of each other somehow, then it says those solutions appear economically prohibitive on the basis of discounting once everything else has come into the picture and there are no other plausible solutions. I'm asking this first as a question. Isn't this like a story of many technologies, let's say, which kind of corner issues even more? But also to ask you to talk a little bit about, toward the end of the book, when you do try to imagine alternatives to discounting or alternative, not simply alternative rates, to what degree that's plausible. I was really curious about that because in a way, if the point is that we should just change the rate of discounting kind of at will, that doesn't portend well somehow. Like that would be nice to be able to do, but my assumption is that the moment that you have all these other technologies, it would actually probably go the wrong way once actual actors can start playing with it. The other, nice about Shen, but what happens when the actors are somewhere between, I don't know, DeSantis and Trump, or when their beliefs are between DeSantis and Trump. So that's really one version. And then what happens when we're thinking in alternative possibilities or an alternative compounding system for handling discounting, environmental questions, other social questions?
And there are two kinds of alternatives that I evoke in the conclusion, and I try to play with. One is to stay with the discounting, and the other one is to move to completely different ways of relating to the future. If discounting is premised on the assumption that there is a future, actually, when Nordhaus, for example, is argumenting his view, he would say that better and better technologies will appear in the future. We will have more knowledge. Future generations will be richer and more knowledgeable, so which reflects the idea of economic growth, of technological progress. So there will be a future, and because this future is getting better and better, we can still stay with discounting. That's the premise of, I think, of his thinking, and the premise of discounting, that there is a kind of future. And this is also related to what I was saying earlier about discounting coming in forests, where the future is kind of almost guaranteed, or at least visible. So this is one possibility. If we try to think of the idea, take seriously the idea that maybe there is no future, or at least we cannot count on the future in order to act on the present, then there would be different alternatives of thinking about what should be done without framing these decisions in terms of an investment into the future that will bring benefits in the present. And that would probably also require us to move away from the notion of value and of valuation, which is penetrated by this future orientation and by this the thinking of economics. And what you were saying about rights, for example, I think that's a very interesting alternative, right? Because rights doesn't have to do with a specific temporality, doesn't have to do with the problem of valuation. So one way of thinking about alternatives would be to say, let's assume there is no future, and it's not so difficult to assume this now, and see how we can discuss about what should be done without this reference to the future. Another alternative I'm pointing at, it builds on the work of Michel Fair in particular, and his book Rated Agency, is to say, okay, what happens if the poor and we all take up the same language, the language of investors, and say, okay, we are also investors in our own futures. And I have this example of at the end, which is a fictitious example, but I like thinking with it. When oil companies buy land from the populations that they need to displace in order to construct pipeline projects, they value this land not with discounting, but with by reference to current market prices, so a temporality of the present, which makes the result is that land is much cheaper. And this can also, be justified by the idea that anyway the poor, they don't have a future, so let's value this land only in the present. And at the same time, when oil companies would make presentations to their investors, they would be valuing themselves by relation to the future. So the kind of thought experiments I was thinking about is, okay, what would happen if the populations who live in the land that oil companies would like to buy make the same calculation? They would say, they could say, okay, this land is an investment for me, and actually it's much more valuable, and the price I would require for you to take this land is the price of the future, of my future that you're buying. So that's a different alternative. It's about, okay, if we admit that we are probably trapped with discounting? What would happen if we subvert it in a way and use it in a way in a very similar way? Yeah. So these are two alternatives that I've been thinking about. Yeah.
Thanks. I'm Ainen. I'm Ainen Lo. I'm a graduate student in history science. And thanks so much. I really look forward to reading the book. My question follows up on the exchange with Professor Mitchell, and I guess I'm interested in the sort of a set of ideas I think are sort of related to discounting, which is the sort of emergence of interest, philosophical and economic interest in like unborn generations. In the 1960s, amidst a sort of perceived overpopulation crisis. And so I guess it just makes me wonder sort of like, does discounting assume a sort of theory of populations and population change, both in terms of its numbers and or its composition, and sort of in relation to the environment, I guess both historically and in the present. Because it seems to me it takes a very static view of populations and population change. And that seems to be not true. And so sort of like how does discounting sort of understand like what populations are like in the world and sort of like how they change?
That's an interesting question. I haven't seen any links between discounting and that kind of thinking in terms of populations. But I suppose that if links were to be made, they could go in the following way. Discounting, as I said, assumes a future that is better than today, than the present, so that we can tax it. So indeed, I think this is. I mean, I continue thinking also with this question, and population. This requires population growth in particular, together with economic growth and with technological progress. So yeah, there hasn't been any. I haven't seen any specific mention of this, but what is the basis of discounting is this idea that there will be a future, and for a future to exist, there needs to be populations that grow. So, but this is I'm speculating. I mean, there hasn't been any specific mention of this in the writings of discounting authors that I have been reading.
So, Stephen Gross, and
Steve Gross from the history department here at NYU. This is really fascinating. I'm super looking forward to reading the book. I just wanted to ask if you have explored at all the history of opportunity cost and how this features in. If you take like a Finance 101 course and learn about ROI, return on investment, that's the way that they kind of explain discounting. If I have capital, what else am I going to do that's going to make more return? And so how does this factor into your kind of intellectual discussion? And is there like did you do a genealogy, or do you know of genealogies of that?
let's maybe do two questions at a time.
I was kind of interested in going back.
Would you?
Yeah, my name is Hilton, and I'm a PhD. So, last year. So I guess I'm interested in this question of calculation and how it relates to things in the history of economic thought, and the thing that Weber talks about in the Protestant ethic, where it's talking about not so much, yes, deferring to the future, but also like present day consumption. So he talks about this mentality of the capitalist that's been the last day of the fossil fuels is actually being consumed. And I was wondering if you could maybe say a little bit about this consumption side and how actually that's part of discounting. So maybe not so much we're just preserving things into the future and we're not eating the marshmallow that they're eating to the poor kids, but actually that we're doing more in the present. We're actually buying more televisions.
Okay, the opportunity cost is central to discounting, to the idea of discounting. In the early justifications of the discount rate, forestry in particular, because forests had been valued for a long time with reference to the future, to the growth, to the physical growth, right? So you determine the right moment when you should cut a tree, based on calculations of the physical growth. At some moment appears this idea that each time that you do not cut a tree, not do something, which this is the interesting thing with discounting, it's about not doing things. You, as a forest owner, are actually undergoing a sacrifice because you could have cut the tree, sell it in the market, put the money in the bank and get an interest rate. So this is the idea of opportunity, of an alternative opportunity. And this is how the discount rate is justified already in the 18th century by French foresters. This idea of each time I'm not consuming immediately something in order to sell it, I'm losing an opportunity. And what happens in the 1950s with the redefinition of the discount rate from the cost of from the rate of interest to the cost of capital is the expansion of this opportunity scenario that is missed, not only with reference to putting the money in the bank, but with putting the money anywhere else in the economy. So in a way, when the discount rate is defined as the cost of capital, it gets higher also because it has to compete with any possible other course of action that you would do. So, for example, in financial markets, any other possible of shares that you could buy. So it's really central in the definition of the discount rate. And I haven't seen good genealogies of the opportunity cost, and I would love to do so because I think that this is very central also to things that are going on today, thinking about the counterfactual, the idea of a counterfactual, which is very much related to this idea of opportunity. About consumption, there is a very, I'm building on the work of Pierre Bourdieu. He has a very nice article about temporal dispositions, and where he analyzes the changes brought by capitalism to when arriving in peasant societies in Algeria, the peasant society in Algeria, and he contrasts these two ways of disposing with time. One is the one that was incumbent there, in which peasants would relate to the present in terms of, to the future in terms of reserve, of preserve and reserve, right? You would keep things for next year, for example. And so it's a very peculiar relationship with the future, this idea of preservation and a reserve, constituting reserves. And he would argue that when capitalism arrives with this idea of the opening of the future, very similar to what Kozelek is saying, the relationship, the idea of preserving and reserving something for the future completely disappears and is being replaced by this idea of investment, rather than keeping the present and making it last longer in a future that would actually look pretty much like the present, right? Because it's a preservation and reservation. The future becomes unknowable, uncertain, and the idea of preserving or reserving doesn't make sense anymore. So yeah, it would be like an opposite relationship to an opposite temporal disposition, the idea of preserving and.
A question from the chat from Lorena Regatieri, I'm sorry, who is in the Pan-Amazon Basin Technopolitics Coalition in Brazil. Asks, given your expertise in the intersections of economy, valuation, and technology, can you elaborate on how the latest technological advances storage are being perceived within economic frameworks to discount the future? Specifically, how these technologies unequally distribute our present environmental resources and responsibilities across technologies, what implications this may have for climate modeling and economic valuation. So that's one. The next question.
Let Liliana answer first. Then
No, go ahead.
last one. Okay. So I'm Andrew Fitzmaurice. I'm currently at the Park Institute. I was from the university. Liliana, I'm still trying to get my head around this. Really intellectually challenged. So if Stern's approach fails and we come back to the market, isn't the discounting in the market, so the discounting is determined in the market by expectations. Isn't another way in which to approach this problem to attempt to shape those expectations?
Okay, so answer
I can
first
bring
to
that up if you
Lorena's question about carbon capture. It's I think what's going on now with forests in particular, because it's a continuation of what started in the 19th century, with only the future of forests is becoming more valuable, because forests now not only produce wood, that can be sold, etc., but they also produce the possibility to how can I say, to preserve the environment, and also to, in carbon credits, etc. And what is going on now with forests is this. It reminds me a lot about what happened in the 19th century, in which there are conflicts of temporalities that are being again replayed and recast around the idea of planting trees, for example. So the idea that it is the future of forests that matters, and this future is being extended even further and imbued with even more value, is a vivid illustration in the ways in which discounting, which is challenged by climate change, etc., has become actually extended and has integrated that kind of critiques in order to resist, in a way, the idea of environmental change. So adding like our current solutions to the environment related to carbon capture and forest planting are one way of adding in the future flows of costs and revenues that forests produce. So it's a continuation of the same kind of thinking, which triggers again the same kind of conflicts of temporalities when we look at concrete territories in which forests are planted, etc. So to me, it's a continuation of discounting, and it's an illustration of the surprising capacity of discounting to integrate critique and novel concerns related to the environment, while being at the same time inherently contradictory with this idea of caring for the future. Andrew, expectations, shaping expectations.
Can I just add to my
Yeah.
question that I come from a country, Australia, where there was an attempt to implement Stern's ideas by a Labour government at about the time his report came out. The attempt to do that brought down the Labour government. And subsequently, the only way forward seems to be to shape public debate.
I think it's difficult for me to answer this in relation with discounting, at least. It's the question is, whose expectations are being taken into account and integrated into these calculations. In the case of forests, for example, the expectations that are being taken into account when trees are planted in places in Latin America, for example, are the expectations of investors, in a way, right? And this idea that investors have expectations that have some kind of stronger legitimacy than expectations that other kinds of actors would have is disturbing, and at the same time is pretty easily observable in many different places. This there's this notion of legitimate expectations that is starting to be used now in investor-state dispute settlement, with the idea, the idea that investors, when they make valuations, they form a certain kind of expectations, and by the simple way of forming these expectations, they're in a way allowed to see these expectations happen. And the current use of discounting, increasing use of discounting in investor-state dispute settlement is reinforcing this idea. So to me, it's not only about shaping expectations, but also about which actors' expectations are considered as legitimate, given that by definition expectations about the future are irrational, some would say, or at least speculative, because nobody, the future is unknown. Yeah.
So I have several people in a row. So if you would please move into sort of lightning round scenario of questions now. Luke, and then Alex Evan.
Hi, thank you. I'm Luke Glupo, PhD student here at NYU in Spanish and a remark doctoral fellow. I've just been kind of playing around in my head with this notion of nature and natural notions of the natural in these economic questions, which, as you point out, are complete, fabrications. And I was just curious about this example, having not read the book about forests. This question that they kind of represent this future, that they'll return to be what they were before they were exploited for timber, et cetera. Is there a thought about degradation that's going to happen that, with climate change, with invasive species, with, bugs, viruses, et cetera, that we're projecting onto a future that is just a past that no longer exists and won't in the same way? And I was just wondering if there's any thought given to that.
Hi, I'm Alexander Zevin. I teach history at CUNY. I had a question about the development of older technology or the adaptation of an older technology, which discounting would seem to be. You talked about forests in the 19th century, but also think about it as a part of international trade and bills of exchange and bills of discount and sort of merchant capital, finance capital gets adapted in the 19th century, and that sounds like again in the 20th. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about sort of the larger needs of development of capitalism. One answer is that it's advantageous to capitalists, and that example you ended with at the end of the book, that they use one measure to value land and another to sell that investment to investors. This is two different measures of value. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the kind of needs of capital more largely that these transitions in your book respond to, historically speaking. So why is it that this technology that's a bit older gets adapted and used in different ways at these maybe key moments in your book in the 19th and then in the mid 20th century?
Ian Gray from the Climate School of Columbia. So I had a question about a different dispute between economists, including Bill Nordhaus, but not Nicholas Stern, but Marty Weitzman from Harvard, who was also a climate economist and who had a different conception of how to calculate the problem of climate change, related more to damage functions and how we calculate damage. So, and next to this question that was earlier raised about the degradation of forests, the damage functions are what you kind of assess what impacts climate is going to have on your ability to continue producing, economic goods and revenue and things like that. So Nordhaus, for a long time, he kind of claimed that the science on impacts of climate change is pretty uncertain. It has a lot of unknowns about what's going to happen in specific sectors and specific places. And so he can discount the impacts in a way that lead him to generate the kind of discount rates he does. Weitzman has a very different perspective where he thinks that we need to think about the problem of climate change as a problem of insurance, not about optimizing price for the future and discounting the price rate and the value, but more that there's an extreme value, or there's an extreme tail of risk. And like an insurance policy, we should, as states and governments, thinking about how to spend our money around those extreme. So one question is, are damages something that exists in the way that the discount technology has operated? It's kind of like an opportunity cost, but not quite the same. It seems kind of unique to climate, but I'm curious because I don't actually know the details. I wonder if you've thought about, or is that in the book at all, this Weitzman-Nordhaus dispute? Okay.
Degradation. I'll continue with the example of forest once again. It's interesting what is happening in forest today, because at the same time there is this turn to the future in which forests are supposed to become more and more valuable and to secure these carbon credits that we and capture carbon. At the same time, when you talk with foresters, they're extremely worried by the accelerating temporality of damages that are observed in forests today. I don't know about what's going on in the US, but in Europe, forests are suffering. They're suffering from parasites, trees are dying, etc. So there is this, how can I say, this interesting coexistence of two very different temporalities in which forests at the same time are supposed to be to live in a longer future, and by living in a longer future help us secure our own future by capturing carbon, etc. And at the same time they are the how can I say, the witnesses of an accelerating end of the future, if we could say. And these two coexist, I think, in very different circles, because the foresters who worry about forests dying, with whom I have been speaking, are rather foresters who manage forests, and at the same time those who would, when you see forest positions in discourses about longer future and investment, there would be more discourses in public policy, with countries positioning themselves to sell their forests to international investors. So these two temporalities exist, but for the moment, as far as I know, remain completely distinct, as if it was possible at the same time to have an endless future and to not have a future at all. So that's quite interesting. The needs of capital and there is this a very nice paper by Nigel Thrift and Andrew Leishon, which is called The Capitalization of Almost Everything, in which they talk about how capital needs constantly find new sources to be capitalized. And this is part of the dynamics of capital. So my answer would be quite close to that one. If we take capital following Irving Fisher's idea, not as something that exists as distinct from labor, for example, but as anything that can be transformed into capital by processes of capitalization, or this idea of projecting things into the future, then this would, the need that the expansion of technique would drive would be that need of matter of capitalization, things to transform into future flows. And last question. This controversy is not. I haven't been following this controversy, but it's interesting to see how the treatment of uncertainty comes into discounting. There are two reasons to. I mean, damages appear as costs in discounting calculations, right? As future costs. And there are two reasons for discounting these costs. One is the fact that they are distant in time. So that's the idea of the interest rate. The other one is the idea of uncertainty. The idea being that the more something is uncertain, the less it is valuable. So, or the less it should be given value in the calculations. And these treatments of uncertainty are when integrated into discounting, are one of the reasons why the future is worth so much less than the present, according to these theories. So the argument that something is uncertain, it often is integrated in discounting calculations, is not something that impedes discounting, but is something that is integrated by means of an even further devaluation of the future because of its uncertainty. And an insurance principle wouldn't work that way. And that would be indeed interesting. I haven't been following this controversy, but I can see how the treatment of uncertainty would be very different in discounting and insurance, where uncertainty is rather translated into risk and secured against.
I have an ever-growing list. So I think what I'm going to propose is that we close things off here now and leave Liliana off the hook. And you can all come up and discuss things with her as we proceed. As you can see, also the value of this conversation on the book comes into the fact that the questions keep getting bigger and bigger. So I think this is a good moment to say thank you, Liliana. This was good. Thank you.